Thank you so much. Good morning, Breakfast Clubbers. That's an amazing title for a group. I love that. Can everyone hear me okay? Am I good to just jump right in? I am so excited. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you so much for being here, for sharing your morning with me, for inviting me to share my morning with you. Again, my name is Dominique Luster. I'm the CEO of the Luster Company. I am here on the East Coast. I'm actually in Virginia. So I am past my first cup of coffee, but by the end of this, I might have to go get a second. So if I may, before I dive right in, I would love to answer the question, if I can, about the last time I've blown up. I know it was for the group, but I'd love to just okay. So I will say to the gentleman who blew up at the airport, who blows up at the airport or has in the past. Let me tell you about the time we successfully went to Hawaii, but had to stop in every single time zone from Virginia to Hawaii on 5 different planes in 5 different time zones over 24 hours. They lost our baggage. I mean, if you can imagine, by the time we actually got to Hawaii and to know that our bags were somewhere, they had no idea. They had no idea. They couldn't even tell us, oh, your bags are at your stop in Texas. They were just like, okay, it's good luck. I have been there. As you can imagine, I have been there. So, but that was probably the last time I blew up. But I feel like that's valid. 5 time zones. I just feel like it doesn't matter. Anyway, so thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I wanted to start by kind of talking a little bit about well, essentially myself, if that's okay. So when I was thinking recently about when I was in college, and I went to the University of Kentucky, Go Cats. There is no greater basketball team in NCAA. But went to the University of Kentucky, and I was a theater major. And I remember I very strongly believed that there was no such thing as a starving artist. And at the time, I remember just needing a job. I needed an on-campus job, and I really didn't care where it was. I just needed an on-campus job, and I remember at the time the highest paying job was in the library, was in the Archives and Special Collections library. And fun fact, I remember that job was about $15 an hour, which at the time, and this was probably, I don't know. It was definitely not a mandatory minimum at that point. $15 an hour as an on-campus student job where everyone else was making $7.25, and I was making $15 an hour in the library, and I didn't have to lift things or work in dining services or deal with residents. I mean, it was amazing. And I started working in the library, in the archives and special collections, just because that was the job that was paying the most. But I ended up coming to really love the work. I loved the material that I was working with. I loved the idea of old things. I remember as a little girl volunteering at my local public library. And so, fast forward, my mother should have realized that I would become a librarian, but that's on her. And I remember really enjoying the work. And I got to a point where I was voluntold. I don't know if you're familiar with that phrase, but I was voluntold one day that I was going to go to library school because I just returned back from Germany where I had completed a Fulbright, and I worked on if you're familiar with the Fulbright program, you have to write this massive thesis of 200 pages that you will never get back of your life. But I did it. And I remember using archival sources at that time. And I remember in this on-campus job, I was kind of blending all these things together. I was like, oh, I remember doing this for my Fulbright. I remember working with archives and old letters and old diaries and old documents and old photographs as a part of my thesis. And I remember my supervisor and my mentor at the time told me that I was going to go to library school. And I remember staring at her thinking, you are out of your mind. First off, I have a reputation. I can't go to library school. That is not a real thing. I can go to business school. I can go to law school. I can go to med school. No one with real street credibility is going to a thing called library school. But I went, and I'm so glad that I did, because I've been an archivist for probably the past 10 or so years, 10, 15 years. And, I at the time couldn't have thought of anything less cool. But now I can't imagine doing anything better with my time, with my life, with the resources that God has stored through me on this earth. And as an archivist, well, let me actually just back up and explain. An archivist is a type of information professional that's kind of like the cousin to a librarian, and like the second cousin to a genealogist, and like the niece to a historian. If that made sense to anyone, you are my kind of people. An archivist is kind of all of these roles intersect with the philosophy that is history, or the discipline that is history, but approach it in different ways. So a librarian is kind of the person who might help you find whatever resource that you're looking for. A genealogist is specifically the person that might help you trace your family backwards using historic documents. An archivist is the person who helps preserve those historic documents. And the historian is the person that kind of tries to tie it all together through interpretation and presentation. That could be as a professor, that could be as a writer, as a scholar, as a filmmaker, as a symphony producer, as a opera producer. I think that's very, very cool. All of those roles kind of intersect and interact with the discipline of history, even though they come at it from these unique angles. But for me, as an archivist, history isn't just the study of the past as it is described in documents, though that is true. It's if history was really just about all the things that happened, it would just be called the past, in my opinion. The history is not everything that happened backward. That is, or excuse me, history isn't everything that happened backwards. That is literally a chronology, and a chronology does not make for history. History goes beyond studying facts. It goes into the realm of interpretation, analysis, synthesizing those facts, synthesizing and creating stories that blend all of those things together. All the work of the archivist, all the work of the historians, all the works of the genealogists informs stories, right? And these stories are really where the stuff gets good. The stories that we tell is where the history kind of comes to life. The past comes to life and becomes something that we can interact with. And so if it's of help or use to anyone, I thought I'd start by just kind of sharing what creates history. So let's think about if we dissect or deconstructed this idea of history, of making, of storytelling. It kind of breaks down into some models or some methods or some steps that you can kind of put together to figure out how we can best utilize it moving forward. So first, history is really like the principle of the discipline of history, or of history making as a practice, really comes from this idea of collecting of sources first. Like the first battleground is the collection of resources. And that's really where the archivists kind of play in. It involves the gathering of primary and secondary sources, primary sources being firsthand accounts or the direct evidence of a thing, of a topic, of an event, of a person. It's the diary, the photograph, sort of depends on the photograph, but the diary, the letter, that primary source is the oral history interview with your great grandparents. That those firsthand accounts, those are what we call primary sources. And then secondary sources, as the name might suggest, are books or things written after the fact as recollections of those primary sources. It can include books or documentaries or documentary series, like the History Channel has these new docu-series like The Blank That Made America or The Blank That Made the World. They've done the toys that make the world, the food that's made America, the cars that have made the world. It's been a very fascinating series if you're into history and stories as much as I am. But the second part of that, so the first part was the gathering of documents. The second part is the critical analysis of those documents and of those sources to understand their content, context, and structure. So content, context, and structure is the I don't know, again, the philosophy, the theory that we use to situate a story. It's where we get characters. It's where we get time. It's where we get the who, what, when, where, why. The contextualizing is where a story actually starts, is where someone's history or the understanding of themselves as in their narrativity and their personhood starts through the analysis of what's happening around them. So oftentimes when I work with genealogists, we're not just looking at this person was born in this state, this person was married in this state, this person had a child in this state. We're really looking at this person was born in this time to these parents, in these circumstances, in this situation, in this environment, in this economy, in this administration. There's a lot of components that make up someone's story, not just the date that they were born or the date that they were married or the date that they moved to Hawaii. Though, as if you're going to Hawaii, just get a direct flight. It was not worth it. It was wonderful, but get the direct flight. And the interpretation kind of comes on top of that, right? So now that we build content, context, and structure of a fact, we then have the power to interpret those content, context, and structures to create interpretations, to create the story. Now is the first time we're actually creating a story in this history-making process. And it's kind of based on the analysis. We use narrative metrics that are essentially cultural, storytelling as a cultural based thing that varies from culture to culture, varies from time to time, to make judgments about what happened or to make analysis, interpretation, cause and effect. We start to form the true emphasis of what a story is, of what a history is in this stage of the process. And then we tell it. But here's the thing, that presentation, that telling of history is also based in a content, context, and structure. It's important to remember that history can be told, but then it can be retold later. And that retelling can change. It can be new. We can learn something new. We can learn something was changed. We can learn something wasn't what we thought it was. We can learn that that person was not even in the room. I don't know if you've ever had a family scenario. Just as a quick illustration, there were multiple people. Everybody was at this dinner, or everybody was at this family party, or everyone was at Easter. Everyone saw the thing happen. Yet Aunt Sue said something different. Aunt Mary said something different, and Uncle Jim said something different. I don't know if that has ever happened to you, but we were all there and the same event happened, and yet three people saw three different things. That process that quickly is literally how history is formed, just at scale. If I could give you an analogy, history can be created and recreated and continuously reinterpreted as we as a society and we as a humanity continue to grow and to develop and to think and to have new perspectives and new interpretations. We have the ability to create these more dynamic and evolving fields that help all of us really understand our past and how it will shape our future. And so that's kind of where we're going with these thoughts, or with my research with the Luster Company, is how do we understand how history is made, the science behind history is made, because I firmly believe that what got us here might not get us there. So that's what I'm kind of hoping that we can talk about collectively. And I really want to kind of talk through my main parts quickly so that we can have more time for Q&A. But one of the things that I find often, or that one of the things that my company gets called in to work with often, is the history and the stories of the period of enslavement in American culture. We are a archival consulting firm that specializes in African American history and culture, and I have, by training, have specialized in African American history and culture, predominantly 19th, mostly 20th century, and what that has looked like across the country in many different environments, scenarios, and states, times. We can get into that during the Q&A. But one of the things that I have found, and I'm really glad that we're gonna kind of have more of a Q&A, but one of the things that I find that a lot of folks don't really realize is that in our work as archivists, the majority of information, the majority of history that we have about the institution of slavery in America comes not from enslaved individuals or formerly enslaved individuals. It actually comes from the football fields of ledgers and of bills of sale and of fugitive slave advertisements and of any other piece of material that talks about a person but doesn't offer voice of that person. And so what we get here is this really complicated understanding of history where the history has been told based on the primary sources that we get. You remember those 4 or 5 steps that we just talked through. The primary sources that we have to understand this content, context, and structure of these things really comes from a fairly limited view. It's not a singular view, but it's a fairly more limited window. It doesn't come from the voices of the enslaved all that often. And that evidence is what shapes what we now know. But is it, I guess the question that I always ask when we work with institutions through our consultancy is it the full story? Is it a complete story? Is it a holistic story? Is it an expansive story? Because what we know about this institution 250 years ago doesn't have to be all that we know about our lives, about our culture, about our society, and who we are now and where we'd like to be 250 years from today. And where I think it's actually very interesting, it's not where I specialize, but what I think is very interesting, unlike 250 years ago, today, video evidence and photographs, and everybody in the world has a smartphone, and the internet and social media and Twitter, which I really don't understand. Like, I am not on there. It moves way too fast for me. I don't get it, but I know that a lot of people use social media and Twitter very rapidly. There is a plethora of opportunity now to democratize a multiplicity of voices and a multiplicity of stories for the first time at scale in human history. And so now all of a sudden we have the ability to democratize the history making process, right? Because remember what I was saying is that history gets started by the collection or the gathering of those primary sources, of those original pieces. But now if you have lots of different original pieces to come together, you have lots of different voices that can contribute into those primary source gathering. Therefore, history can be more broad. We've entered an era, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, but we've entered an era in which the phenomenon hasn't changed. The phenomenon that is history making, the process of it has not changed, but the modality of how it's done no longer favors exceptionalism. Just my opinion, but it no longer favors exceptionalism in the idea that a singular voice can drive a story or a singular voice can drive a narrative. It doesn't mean that a singular voice isn't important. It just means that more voices can now contribute to how stories get shaped. And everyday people, in my opinion, everyday people now have the ability to impact histories and to impact future histories in ways that we've never experienced before. I think as an archivist, oftentimes we study historiography, not necessarily history, but historiography. We study how history is created. And one of the most similar eras that we are in is with the advent of pressed paper and the ability to write on, well, not necessarily just pressed paper. It would have been more like a linen. It would have been like a papyrus and things like that. The ability to press something, write something, have written word that can be transferred across trade routes, across spice routes. That is that level of expansion is the kind of level of expansion that we are experiencing now. And I think, in my opinion, or at least my encouragement, is that we have this opportunity. We have this very rare opportunity, and I think that we should take it very seriously And actually, as I say, we should take it seriously. Let me tell you another story about my childhood, or at least a story about my childhood, in a way of illustration. I remember well, let me speak for myself. I remember when I was a kid, I didn't really get a lot of say in whatever we were doing. I didn't get a lot of say in where we were going. I didn't get a lot of say in what we ate, even though I really don't like mushrooms or yogurts. My mother did not care. It's on your plate, better eat it. Love my mother, but it was a space in which if we were going to Target, we were going to Target. I don't like, as a kid, I didn't like sitting in the cart at Target for 4 hours, or at least what felt like 4 hours. I had very little say in what was going on. Not in a terrible way. I was just a child. And when you're a kid, you're just kind of along for the ride, if that makes sense. You're just kind of along for the ride. Again, not in a bad way, it just is what it is. But as I've gotten older and I think back about my childhood, I remember, I realize, or I'm wondering now, I'm wondering if how many of my memories are actually my memories. How many of my memories are actually my memories versus a formed memory based on the story that just got told to me over and over and over again about what happened, right? So going back to the Easter story, everybody was there. You know, if you're a child, you might not remember, but if everybody's there, and every Easter or every Thanksgiving, you hear this story of Uncle Rudolph who did this thing back at the day and this thing happened, or that time that you ran off as a kid, or that time that this happened when you were a kid. How much of your memory is your actual memory versus a compilation of the story that has been told to you, or the photograph that you've seen in the family photo album over and over again? How often has that happened where, if you really stopped and thought about it, you can't quite put your finger on, or you kind of lose track of which parts of any given story came directly from your 10-year-old self versus how much of that is just the history making process. And I think the reason why that story kind of comes to me is because history, the process of history making, is like that. Sometimes we can get so far away from the story, from what was actually happened, from our mother, from our grandmother, from this event in our childhood, from this event in our family's history, from this house that our family purchased and we all grew up in. Sometimes we get so far away from that our memory and the story that we tell over and over again becomes changed. It's an interesting process, and history at a grand scale, at a very grand scale, is kind of like that. The history of a society over 250 years kind of changes ever so slightly over and over and over again, because history as a phenomenon of power is constantly being created and recreated over and over and over again. But here's the thing that I also realized is that currently as an adult, we have an opportunity to be far more present, to be far more active in in the memories that we make. And if we were to use that analogy similarly, history as the grown up version of humanity in our modern day society is a lot like that too. In our current modern society, we have the ability to be more present, to be more active in the process, and not just simply passively allow the story to move forward without our active participation for the next 250 years. And because, we've kind of already discussed that history is not random, and we've also discussed the process of history making being more democratized, now moving into the future, I believe that this practice of history making can be more broad. I think it can be wider and deeper and more abundant and more beautiful, but I do believe that all those things will require more culturally consciousness as we kind of reflect and approach the 250-year anniversary of the United States. And as we look ahead to the next 250 years, I think that this more adult version of us, this more modern version of a society, of a humanity, will require a certain level of cultural awareness, of competency, of active participation that we've not necessarily had to do before, but I would encourage us to do now. And so I think I have maybe like 2 or 3 takeaways of how we could do that. And then I want to open the floor for question and conversation. And the first thing that I kind of want to just throw out there is this idea that more histories are not a threat to any histories. And those are both plural. More histories are not and never a threat to any histories, meaning singularity versus plurality. Those two are not verses. There is space in this world for everyone to shine. There's this British philosopher whose name escapes me. I've been trying to think of it all morning. This is a British philosopher, I believe is British philosopher, that came up with the idea of what's called shine theory. And it's the idea that your shine doesn't make my shine any less, and me shining doesn't make you shine any less. Everybody can shine, and we all just out here glowing. That is kind of how I think of the future. And so I would encourage kind of your thoughts on that. But I find that in my practice, oftentimes when we look at history making and history making processes in our modern day, you often hear, or I would encourage you to listen for hints of control. In controlling of a narrative, controlling of stories, often because control stems from a root of fear, a fear-based and a scarcity-based mindset. But in my opinion, and more abundantly, abundance and abundant moreness, I'm failing with a word there, often stems from this growth-based mindset. And so I would encourage you to choose growth. Secondly, I would encourage you to write it down and make it plain, meaning the modality of history making can be changing, being more democratized, but the history making process still favors the one who wrote it down. So for example, I'd like to share, if you can, or if you're able to, and if you're not, that's okay. I'd like you to either give a thumbs up or a hand raise if you can name your mother's name. Just super quick. Okay. If you can name your mother's name, awesome. I'd also, thank you. I'd like you to raise your hand if you can actually name your grandmother's name. Like, what was her first name? Okay. What about your great-grandmother? Do you know your great-grandmother, your grandmother's mother? What was her name? Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, here's usually the last one. Can you name 4? Let me see, your grandmother, your great-grandmother. You should have 4 great-grandmothers. Can you name them? That's usually where it catches people. It's oftentimes that you might be able to name your mother. You can name both of your grandmothers, their names, but could you name all 4 of your great-grandmothers? They had names. They were women who had lives, who had families, who had children, who served in their community, who were teachers or nurses, who served our country, who fought or who did any millions of things. And yet you don't know their name. Their name is completely lost to history because history favors the person who wrote it down. It is our job, our active participatory job, to write it down and make it plain. Third and finally, I just want to encourage you to remember that history, and I say this all the time, but history does not just happen. These women and their stories and your children and your children's children for generations, their stories do not just happen. Your story will not just happen. It can happen with your active participation. Therefore, the record would be kept and stored and preserved and passed along, and the cookbooks and the photographs and the family Bibles and what happens next can all be preserved and shared, but only with our active participation. Because the thing about history and its phenomenon of power is that it has the ability to uplift some or oppress others. And everyone, whether we like it or not, is a part of that system. And I highly recommend that we be active participants. So that's what I